public importance. I've received a letter from the honourable member for Deakin proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the government's continued failure to tackle the cost of living crisis facing Australian families. I call upon those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places. And I give the call to the honourable member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I don't think I've ever seen a more smug and self-satisfied performance from a Prime Minister when Australians are doing it hard and on a day when things have just got harder for Australians. This Prime Minister stood there at question time with a smug look on his face, telling Australians essentially that they've never had it better. Well, I'll say to the Prime Minister, he has to deliver on some of the commitments he made before the election when he promised Australians that he would reduce cost of living pressures, that he would reduce mortgages, that he would reduce energy prices. Rather, what we see from the Prime Minister now is a refusal to repeat any of those promises. Mr Speaker, we saw today mortgage interest rates rise again, and the Treasurer is very, very keen to make sure whenever he utters the word Reserve Bank, he prefaces it with the Independent Reserve Bank. Now, that doesn't stop members opposite from offering free advice to the Reserve Bank in media interviews left, right and centre. But what he refuses to repeat is that the Reserve Bank's hand is being forced by a government who's putting inflationary upward pressure into the economy. We all recall before the election the Labor Party speaking about wages and how real wages had been going down. Well, what do we think is happening now with real wages? In the quarter to December, when we saw inflation for the quarter at 1.9%, yet wages at 1%, what does that mean? That means that every single person's pay packet is going backwards in real terms under this government. We heard in question time today the last time that mortgage interest rates was this high. That was 2012. We now see mortgage interest rates today the cash rate at 3.35%. And were the Prime Minister here, I would say that a few times to him, 3.35%, 3.35%, just so he could bone up on that, just so he could get that number in his head, which he was clearly unable to do in the middle of the election. But what is the common denominator between the mortgage interest rates we saw in 2012 and the mortgage interest rates we see today? Well, of course, it's the tough luck of the Labor Party. You know, the Labor Party who just stumble upon this terrible luck every time they're in government and the economy suffers. It's just terrible luck. But the other thing in common was that in 2012, guess who the Chief of Staff to the great Wayne Swan was? It was the member for Rankin. The member for Rankin. And over the years, I've often referred to the member for Rankin as Wayne Swan's brain, and he always took it as a compliment, but I didn't mean it as a compliment. But he is the man now who is putting upward pressure, inflationary pressure into the economy that's forcing the hand of the Reserve Bank. And what are we going to see? Well, we know we're going to see approximately 800,000 households who will not just see one interest rate rise. They're not sitting there today doing the sums, doing the maths on what a 0.25% rise will do. There'll be 800,000 households who will see a jump from their fixed rates, in many cases below 2% interest rates, to now prevailing headline interest rates of around 6 or 6.5%, and if not higher. So these people will not be sadly seeing one interest rate rise increase overnight. When their mortgages mature, and 800,000 of them will mature this year, they will see every single one of the 9 interest rate rises to date increase their mortgage overnight. And what's the answer from the government? What's the answer from the Prime Minister? Well, the Prime Minister keeps talking about reconvening the parliament before Christmas on his gas plan. Now, what have we seen since then? I mean, the Prime Minister talks about that being a great achievement. Well, I received a letter into my electorate office just today, so apologies that I'm reading it from my phone. This letter had some even worse news for this person, who not only is now looking at how they're going to meet increased mortgage rates, but it was a letter from Origin Energy. And the letter says, "Hello. On the 1st of February, your natural gas rates are going up. We understand this isn't the news you want to hear, and we're here to help if you need. We estimate that the new rates would cost you $602.74 more, and this is just based on an estimate of your last 12 months of use." So the Prime Minister 97 times before the election promised to deliver $275 reductions to people just like that constituent, and yet since the election, how many times has he mentioned the words 275, let alone the promise? How many? Now, I put the question, the task out to all of those in the chamber. Do a search of Hansard. How many times has the Prime Minister reiterated his promise that he made 97 times before the election that he would deliver $275 reductions in energy prices? He's mentioned it 0 times. He refuses to mention it again. Now, he obviously thinks that the Australian people will just ignore or pretend that he made those promises 97 times. He's fumbled around a couple of times with some fairly flimsy alibis. One alibi that he seems to be throwing out there in order to alleviate his responsibility for those promises was the illegal Russian invasion of the Ukraine. But he forgot that he'd actually made the promise about 30 times after the invasion. After the invasion. So I assume that those on the other side will be scrambling around to try and work out what the next alibi could be for that promise. But what we know is that the government has no plan to deliver on that promise. They've got no plan to put downward pressure, downward inflationary pressures into the economy, to take pressure off the sad decisions that are being made at the moment to increase the cash rate. And so what happens? Millions of Australians will suffer. Millions of Australians will suffer. And what do we get from those in the government? It's just the bad luck of the Labor Party. Every time we come to government, things happen. Well, can I say to those in the government, you're elected to do a job, and when difficult times come, governments are there to make decisions to make the lives of Australians easier. Why are you making it worse? I can say that as being a minister in the former government when the pandemic hit. And rather than run around this building saying, woe is me, the pandemic is making life harder for Australians, isn't that bad luck for us? We took decisions to make Australians' life better through a very difficult time. In my portfolios in that government, we saved 500,000 jobs in the residential construction industry. We didn't say, woe is me, isn't it all just very, very bad news and tough luck for the government? No, you make decisions to make life easier. So what we're seeing here from the government, from a Prime Minister, to be frank, who I think has the worst economic credentials of any Prime Minister that we've ever seen. And there's a few doozies on the Labor side over the years, I have to say. But this is a man who didn't know the cash rate on the first day of the election campaign. He didn't know the cash rate on the first day of the election campaign. I mean, again, I know that those opposite don't want to remember that. But he did not know a fundamental figure that, to be frank, most people walking down the street would know. Certainly anybody with a mortgage would know. That's right. Now, I think that also betrays another aspect to this very smug and self-satisfied Prime Minister. I'm sure in the dinner parties that he attends, the celebrities that he hangs out with,
Tony Jones, he came over for
those who accompanied him to the tennis 3 nights in a row. I mean, on that, Madam Deputy Speaker, look, all Prime Ministers attend the tennis, but 3 nights in a row. He looked very relaxed. He did not look like a man who was sitting there trying to work out a plan to help alleviate the cost of living pressures hitting Australians. On this side of the House, we'll stand up for those people. They are who we represent, they are who we will support, and that is what the government must do in this very